All right, hello and welcome everyone. I think we'll get started. So good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to our conference on a well-being economy for Alberta. My name is Lindsay McLaren. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary and a member of Parkland Institute's board of directors. And it's my pleasure to open our event this evening. I'm privileged to be joining all of you from the ancestral home of the Treaty 7 signatories, which include the Siksika Nation, the Piikani Nation, the Kainai Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation, as well as the Métis people of Alberta Region 3, who call Treaty 7 their home. My own learning about how I can better respect and honor the original caretakers of the land has led me to some amazing work and resources, and I can't resist but mention and highly recommend this recent book in particular called The End of This World: Climate Justice in So-Called Canada. I was going to be excited to note that one of the authors, Crystal Lameman, would be joining us tonight for our opening panel, but unfortunately there has been a change of plans and Crystal is not able to join us after all. We very much look forward to the speakers and panelists who are with us tonight. So this conference is about an economy for everyone, or in other words, an economy that places all people and the environments on which we all fundamentally depend at the center. It needs to be said out loud that this is not the economy we currently have. Our current economic system of neoliberal capitalism prioritizes relentless growth and private profit to the benefit of the few, to the detriment of the many. It does so by driving policies that widen inequalities of income and wealth, which undermines a society based on an ethic of care and reciprocity. It does so by eroding a robust public sector that provides foundations for everyone to be well. And it does so by supporting and in fact encouraging activities that destroy our ecosystems upon which all life depends. Our government's continued support of fossil fuel extraction, while much of our province and country is on fire, is just one illustration of the absurdity of our current model. It also needs to be said out loud that this situation is not natural nor inevitable. It reflects decisions that someone has made. Those decisions could therefore be different. And one way, and perhaps the best way, to work towards something different and better is to come together around an alternative vision. And that is the purpose of this conference. I happen to be situated in the field of public health. In my field, we refer to these dynamics as the social and ecological determinants of population well-being and health equity. They are the root causes of why some people are healthy and others are not, regardless of access to healthcare. We have been talking about them for a long time using that language. But the idea of an economy that puts all people and our planet at the center is not limited to any sector, health or otherwise. It's an idea around which anyone who seeks a fairer and more sustainable world can engage and contribute. It's a way to bring together people from different sectors, disciplines, and perspectives around a bold, coherent vision for the type of society we wish to have. We have a number of thank yous to extend. Firstly, we're grateful for a Connections grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which has allowed to hold this conference and to make it free to attend. Secondly, a very big thank you to the Parkland Institute and its excellent team, both present and past, including Ricardo Acuna, Rebecca Graf-McRae, Charlene Oliver, Rita Espechet, Jason Foster, and Bill Kilgannon. As well, our conference organizing committee, which additionally includes Mark Anielski, Bob Ascah, Gwendolyn Blue, Stan Houston, and David Swan, all of whom you will see and hear from throughout the event. One kind of cool feature of our conference is that we have a graphic note taker. I'm delighted to welcome Tara Simmerich, who is a graphic recorder with Fuse Consulting. Throughout our event, Tara will be making visual posters of what is being presented to help us to connect different perspectives. This is a great fit with this conference's focus on connecting the dots and coming together around a coherent political economy vision. Tara will be visible on screen for much of the conference, and we welcome and encourage you to engage with Tara and her work in real time and also during the breaks using the chat function. Just a quick note that for those of you who registered and are not able to attend, the plenary sessions, including tonight's session, is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Parkland Institute's YouTube channel in the next few weeks. With all of that said, I am now delighted to introduce our moderator for tonight's session, Bob Ascah, who will be no stranger to many in the broad Parkland Institute community and whom I've had the pleasure of getting to know through our planning of this event. Bob brings expertise in commerce, public administration, and political science, and a range of experiences, including with Alberta Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs, Alberta Treasury, and ATB, which is Alberta's and in fact Canada's only public bank, which we will hear more about tomorrow. Bob served as director of the Institute for Public Economics at the University of Alberta from 2009 to 2013, and he is a prolific writer around topics related to political economy. So thanks once again to all of you for joining us this evening, and over to you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay. It's an honor to be the opening night's moderator. I am speaking from lands on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois Dene, Ojibwa, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. I am very excited about this evening's opening address by Jim Stanford, the panel discussion, and the Q&A session. Before introducing Jim, a brief outline of tonight's program and general process. I will introduce Jim, who will speak for approximately 45 minutes with a PowerPoint presentation. Next, I will introduce all the panelists with Marliss Taylor and Mark Anielski, who have 10 to 15 minutes to provide their perspectives on the conference's economic well-being theme. Regrettably, as Lindsay indicated, Crystal Lameman had to withdraw at the last minute, and I will pass along her comments emailed to me earlier when introducing the two panelists for this evening. After the presentation, we will have an exchange of views amongst the keynote speaker and the panelists. We will conclude with a question and answer period. So please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions. So it's a great privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Jim Stanford. He is one of Canada's eminent economists with a talent to explain complex economic concepts and to translate them into everyday practice. He is the economist and director of the Center for Future Work. He is also the Harold Innes Industry Professor at McMaster University and an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney. Previously, we all know Jim for his work for over 20 years as the economist and director of policy with Unifor, formerly the Canadian Auto Workers Union. Jim received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. He holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge and a BA honors from the University of Calgary. As part of my moderator duties, I feel compelled to ask whether the speaker is a dog or cat person. For a little bit of levity, Jim's response was a little unorthodox. He is a unicorn person. So please give a warm welcome to Jim Stanford.
Bob, thank you very much. Bob and Lindsay and the whole team at Parkland. It's such an honor to join your conference online. It would be better if we were all in person, of course, but we'll do that as soon as we can. I'm a unicorn. I chose that one, Bob, because many of people think I'm utopian and I'm living in a fairy tale. Just for the nerve, you know, the audacity of imagining that an economy could work for people rather than for profits. And so if I'm living in a fairy tale world, I want to be a unicorn. A dazzling, multicolored pride, the whole pride rainbow on my wings, sparkles on my horn, and the whole bit. Okay, so that's where the unicorn came from. If you're going to be utopian, you might as well go all the way. I am just so grateful to Parkland for the work, the hard work that you do, creating a credible, evidence-based, well-documented set of alternative policies that can make Alberta a much, much better place for everyone who lives there and for the environment. And Parkland for many years has been a vanguard in calling out the lies and false assumptions of neoliberal orthodoxy, which of course has a big hold in Alberta, but like elsewhere in Canada and around the world, and inspiring and educating Albertans to hope for something better and to realize that something better is not just possible, it's necessary. So thank you very much, Parkland. I've spoken at other Parkland events in the past, and it's always a great honor to come back. And of course, right now is it's more critical than ever that Parkland keep doing its work, because of course, with the last election and what for most of us was a disappointing outcome, but we were proud of the positive effort that was put into enunciating a better vision for Alberta. But we are stuck with this lot of inconsistent, unethical, short-term, populist, hate harvesting folks in this government. That is obviously a threat to well-being and the environment and democracy, frankly. So progressives, any Albertan with a progressive bone in their body has got to be thinking now for the next few years, how do we make the most of progressive arguments and encourage people to push back and defend what's great about Alberta and help build something that's even better. Bob mentioned in the outset, I did my first degree at the University of Calgary, and I am a native-born Albertan. Whenever I get the trolls, Daniel Smith trolls or Pierre Poilievre's trolls on my tail on social media or anywhere else, they're always lambasting me for being an Eastern bastard or a Laurentian elite. And they're always snookered when I say, nope, born in Alberta and here's my birth certificate. So I still got great family and connections in Alberta. Some of my family's on this call tonight, I see, which is lovely. Thank you very much. Mom and Dad for coming. That's great. And I have great passion for Alberta and what it has been in the past and the best things about it today and what it can be in the future.
I can talk in this one.
I will show some slides to run through my presentation on how do we imagine economics from a different point of view, a very people-centered point of view. I'm just going to give you one heads up. At exactly 7 o'clock Alberta time, my lights are going to go out. And this is because I'm so concerned with energy conservation. I work in an office where the lights shut off after regular working hours, every hour on the hour. And there's nothing I can do about it. I can't even just wave. I have to run to the front door of the office and flick the lights on. So that'll just take 2 seconds, okay? So don't be shocked when you see me run off stage right. Okay, let me share the slides and then we'll get on with it. And I look forward to the discussion, including with our distinguished panel afterwards. So here we have the economy is us. This is the core point of my presentation. I teach a lot of adult education with trade union members and community members, trying to demystify economics. And if I have one one precise slogan at the center of my presentation. It's that the economy is us. We are the economy. We are not here to serve the economy. We actually make up the economy. We drive the economy, and everything that happens in the economy, we take care of. So that is the slogan. This is my website, the center's website, the centerforfuturework.ca. So we have a lot of information that is published on our site. It's all open access. And there's my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle. If anyone would like to post from this presentation tonight and join the conversation online, you're more than welcome. Although for all I know, given Elon Musk in charge of it all, Twitter could collapse by the time this presentation is over. So why do I even bother putting up Twitter handles? Good one, eh? And a couple of other resources I want to point you towards. One is on our site, on the online learning section of our site, centerforfuturework.ca. We have some materials for online learning, including some resources from a 10-part course that we taught on economics for everyone. And that includes videos, lecture notes, PowerPoint slides, supplementary readings, and so on. So for anyone else, for anyone who'd like to do more learning on economics from a different point of view, then please visit that area of our website, and you can have free access to all the materials there. A second resource I want to point out, and I'm not making a plug here to earn big fat publishing royalties. I don't get a cent from the sales of my book, Economics for Everyone. All the royalties, such as they are, go to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, our partner with the Parkland Institute, progressive think tank in Canada. But there is a book called Economics for Everyone that was based on adult education course for union members that I developed when I was the economist with the Canadian Auto Workers, now Unifor. And I'm proud of this book because it's a book that you can actually read. It's been translated into 6 languages, one of which is English. And that's more than you can say for most economics books, believe me, because they get you all boggled down in technicalities and formulas and charts and graphs, and no one of a normal mind can make sense of it. But this one is written in plain English for non-specialists, and in addition, there's a whole bunch of teaching materials. I know there's a lot of teachers, school teachers and university educators, college educators involved in Parkland. That website, economicsforeveryone.ca, has a bunch of pedagogical materials that you're allowed to use for free as well. So please think of this as just the start. This is just the opening keynote, of course, for a whole conference about how do we build a better, more balanced understanding of economics, and think of those as resources that might be useful as you carry on that mission. Now, I talked about economists doing all the charts and graphs and formulas and everything. Economists are famous for being very, very boring. In fact, they say that an economist is someone who's good with numbers but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. Okay, so that's just a warning for you ahead of time. But again, we will try to keep this intelligible because that's the whole point of building an accessible participatory economics. So, okay, so what is the economy anyway? This is starting from scratch, starting from basics here. We are told that the economy is all about the quarterly GDP statistics, okay? Or we're told that the economy is about all the financial tables that are published. They used to be published at the back of the newspaper, not anymore. Now you have to go online to get the financial market updates. Or we're told the economy is all about this guy, okay? Joe Blow Broker. Joe Blow Broker, who comes on TV 3 times a day, you know, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and 6 o'clock, to give us the daily market update, right? What's important in the economy? What happened on the paper markets? And Joe Blow Broker comes on and says, well, the markets are up 2 points today because investor confidence strengthened. Ooh, Joe, that is a very deep statement. Investor confidence strengthened and the markets rose, did they? Wow. That's like saying it was bright outside because the sun rose in the east. Okay, that actually didn't give you any useful information whatsoever. And then the worst bit is the next day he comes back on and says, well, the markets are down 2 points because investor confidence weakened. okay, which again didn't actually tell you anything. You can't make sense of the pointless ups and downs, but there's a cultural and political message in the fact that this guy's on TV 4 times a day saying absolutely nothing useful. What it is a message to teach us that if you care about the economy, you have to care about the markets. And it has all kinds of nefarious implications, this vision of what the markets are supposedly all about. One of them is the only way to get ahead in life is to learn how to play the markets. And that's what leads all kinds of well-meaning people to do stuff that they shouldn't do without adult supervision, like day trading or buying crypto or buying Dutch tulip bulbs when they're booming. Okay, so secondly, there's this idea that it's an individual solution to any economic challenges you have. Everything, including your retirement, depends on picking the right mutual fund, as opposed to saying, you know what, we operate in a social system, a social structure. Let's organize our society in a way that actually works for people in that social structure. So lots of reasons why this vision is absolutely wrong for us to organize the economy around. So let's think about a different way that we can imagine how the economy works. And what is the economy about? It isn't about the stock markets and the financial tables, and it isn't even about GDP per se. We'll talk a bit about GDP and what it is and what it isn't. At the end of the day, the economy is about work, a 4-letter word, and it feels like a 4-letter word on Monday morning when we have to drag ourselves out of bed and go off and do our job. Okay, but at the end of the day, it is about work, all kinds of work, defined in a very inclusive and broad way, to include people working in the private sector, working in the public sector, people working in a factory or an oil field or a construction site or an office or a shopping mall or a clinic or a school. People doing work that relies on their physical strength and their ability to move things, doing work that relies on their mental capacities and their ability to communicate and solve problems and conceptualize. All of that is work, broadly defined as productive human effort. And when we're going to put people at the center of the economy, we're putting their productive human effort at the center of the economy. The economy is nothing more and nothing less than the sum total of the work that human beings do every day. And we have been doing that work for about 200,000 years, okay? Since we climbed down from the trees somewhere in East Africa, we have had to work to use our brains and our brawn to produce the goods and services that we need to survive and live. And over time, we've learned how to work in different ways. We've learned how to work smarter. Most importantly, we've learned how to use tools in our work, not just our bare hands. And that knowledge has allowed us to be more productive in terms of how we engage with the raw materials we harvest from the natural environment and convert into goods and services to support ourselves as human beings. Without work, there is no economy. And this is, in a way, the most important lesson that I try to teach in all of the adult education on economics that I do. Because workers are constantly told that they are disposable and replaceable. Okay, the people actually doing the hard yards, the physical labor and the mental labor that makes the economy function are constantly told you're a productive input. You're a just-in-time factor of production. As soon as I can find a cheaper way to produce this, perhaps with a robot or a chat GPT, okay, then I'm going to get rid of you, and human labor will be a fringe element, a disposable input. And in fact, that's not true. From top to bottom, work is the only thing that adds value to the resources that we harvest from nature. That is, from the gifts of the environment. They were here before we were, and we better learn how to take care of them. But from that point on, all value added in our economy is produced by human labor, broadly defined. Now, you don't have to go to the stock market. You don't have to turn on, you can't even go to the stock market anymore. There's my lights. 1 minute. There we go. I've saved at least half a kilowatt hour of electricity with that small interruption. Thank you very much. You don't have to go to the stock market. You can't even go to the stock market anymore. There's no place called the stock market. It's all done online. And you don't have to go online and pretend that you're at an actual place. You can actually just go out for a walk in your neighborhood. You can walk around the economy and seeing people work in all the different ways that they work. Okay, you can see what they're doing. You can see how they're using their brains and brawn to produce useful goods and services from the resources we harvest from nature. And then you can see what we do with the stuff that we produce. That's an equally important part of the economy, not just producing, but deciding what we do with what we produce. Some of it is consumed. Some of it is the food, clothing, and shelter and other necessities of life, but also the good things of life that we consume in order to have a good life. Some of it is not consumed. Some of what we produce is reinvested in the economy. That is, we produce it and then we put it back to work in the economy in order to allow ourselves to do more work and better work down the road. We can also talk about money and how we create money and how we use money and who gets money and who doesn't, because in our economy, most of what we produce is bought and sold for money. Not everything, but most is. And so how does that work? And then, of course, in our neighborhood and everywhere else, we have to keep an eye on the natural environment and what we see there in order to make sure that we're interacting with the environment in a way that is sustainable long term. And because I'm more interested in walking around my neighborhood to see the economy rather than visiting the stock market and listening to Joe Blow broker tell me whether confidence is strengthened or weakened, I call this the economics of everyday life, where we actually live, work, and interact with our family and our community. And if we think of economics in a demystified way that has people at the center of it, then we can all prepare ourselves to push back against the Joe Blow brokers of the world and the politicians who think that that's what the economy is all about. So here we are walking downtown Calgary somewhere. Calgary's my hometown. Everything that makes up the economy is right here. You see people working. You see them consuming, buying food and other necessities of life. You see investment happening. That is work that isn't consumed, but is pumped back into the economy. That crane in the background that's building something is a form of investment. You see finance, the ATMs and the credit cards and the other ways that people are transacting. Even money, of course, isn't mostly a physical thing anymore. It's not paper, it's digital. And you see the environment, for better and worse. You see a park, but you also see the pollution happening. And here's my friend. This might be Ricardo Acuna. We're out together and Ricardo says, sure, I see all that, but where can I get a beer? And after all, it is about using our brains and brawn to produce the necessities of life. And I consider beer one of those necessities. So part of our goal, and this informs the whole conference that Parkland has organized, and I'm very proud of Parkland for thinking big in terms of how we reframe all of our discussions about economics, is to reclaim economics, take it away from Joe Blow broker, take it away from the stock markets and the GDP statistics, put people in the middle of it, and talk about what's required for an economy that actually works for people. And in this regard, we have to challenge the false authority that economics has over so many of our debates. So we have a situation where conventional economics is as much about justifying the current economy as it is about actually explaining the economy. Most of the assumptions and fundamental theorems and conclusions of conventional neoclassical economics, which underpins neoliberalism and trickle-down theory, the whole idea that markets are efficient, that everybody's naturally greedy, that supply and demand determines how things work. Those ideas are all embedded in an ideology that's more about justifying capitalism than actually explaining it, let alone how to make it work better. And most of the economists who practice that craft, that kind of wizardry, are paid to have a vested interest in the status quo. You go on TV and by and large, most of the economists you see will be working for banks or chambers of commerce or even economics or business departments from corporate funded programs at universities under the whole corporatization of the university system and learning and knowledge creation in our society. So very important that all of us have the capacity and the wherewithal to get enough knowledge and enough confidence to push back at those. to be able to call bullshit, if I can use that technical term. That is a technical term in economics, bullshit. It means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, that's the definition. I have to, because I believe in popular education, I have to define my terms as I go along. We have to be able to push back at the bullshit that tells us what we can't have and why we must tighten our belts and why it's not viable to provide good quality healthcare and good schools and protect the environment. Those are all the things that we're told. And we have to have enough confidence in how we understand an economy that people are at the center of to push back at all of that. And that's why I'm a big believer in popular economic literacy and spend a lot of my career developing resources and teaching courses and trying to promote a more democratic form of economics. And again, my thanks to Parkland for making that a theme of this conference this weekend or this week. So what is the purpose of the economy? The economy is the sum total of our work, our mental and physical work. Why do we work? Well, we work because we have to stay alive. So we have to produce the requirements, the minimum requirements of subsistence, food, clothing, and shelter. But we want more than that. We don't just want to survive. We want to thrive. So we want the good things in life, and that includes education and healthcare and recreation. And everything else that we have. So in other words, the reason that we drag our butts out of bed on Monday morning and go off to do that 4-letter word called work is so that we can individually and collectively support ourselves. That shouldn't be a brilliant insight. That should be obvious, okay, for anyone who actually thinks about the world that they live in, instead of starting from a supply and demand fairyland. So if the purpose of the economy is to meet human needs, then immediately we have an insight into how to evaluate whether the economy is working or not. Is it meeting human needs or not? If humans are surviving and thriving well, particularly, and doing it in a way that's sustainable, both socially and environmentally, then the economy is probably working well. If people are not surviving and thriving well, then there's something wrong with the economy. And you can't disguise that fact by saying that, well, we have to focus on the fundamentals, okay? How many conservative finance ministers have stood up and said, I'm sorry, you all have to tighten your belts, you all have to make do with less, because we have to focus on the fundamentals, okay? And the fundamentals they're thinking about are balancing the budget, getting inflation down, cutting taxes so that we're competitive, okay? Cutting red tape so that business has more freedom and power to decide what happens in life. Those are the so-called fundamentals. But in fact, there's nothing more fundamental than whether human beings are doing well in terms of their actual concrete standard of living. Are they surviving and are they thriving? That's the fundamental goal. And that should be the way that we can evaluate whether the economy is doing a good job or not. Now, what do we produce with our brains and brawn in the course of this economic mission to create the goods and services from the resources we harvest, hopefully sustainably from nature, and survive and thrive? Well, some of what we produce are tangible goods, products that we can touch. Some of what we produce are not tangible goods, but rather services that we perform for each other. Both of those things are important. Okay, both goods and services are necessary to our ability to survive and thrive. Over time, we've shifted more towards services. Today, about 70% of Canada's GDP is in services, 30% is in goods, but we need them both. There's no way that we can get by without shelter and food and clothing and the other tangible necessities of life. But over time, society tends to produce more services, including public services, because once our basic needs have been met, then we're interested in more of those other service-oriented things. And both of them ultimately are produced the same way. There isn't actually a fundamental economic difference between goods and services. They both are produced by human beings using their brains and brawn to take the resources that we harvest from nature and transform them into the things that we need for a good quality of life. Economics is the study of the economy, and when we're doing an economics that has people at the center of it, we have to be critical in understanding the perverse and distorted role that conventional economics plays in in our education system and in our policy and political debates. Economics in theory is the study of how we work and produce the goods and services that we have and what we do with them. Traditionally, it's kind of divided into two camps, sometimes warring camps. Microeconomics is where you're supposedly studying the rational choices of individual consumers and firms and other agents in the economy. This is where the conventional orthodox neoclassical vision of economics is at its most undiluted and perverted, with the assumption that everyone is naturally greedy. This is a ridiculous assumption. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Social anthropologists realize it is human beings' unique capacity to cooperate that explains how we survived when we descended from the trees in East Africa 200,000 years ago, and explains why our brains are shaped and sized the way they are, and why we have a unique social intelligence and ability to communicate. Human beings are the only species on the planet where unrelated individuals cooperate with each other. The only species. So in this regard, they've got it bass-ackwards. Bass-ackwards. That's another technical term in economics. I will define it for you. Bass-ackwards means the direction of causation is fundamentally and unjustifiably reversed. Okay, so that's bass-ackwards. In fact, humans are unique at cooperating, not inherently greedy at all. And the whole assumption that you can build an economic theory based on an assumption about human nature that is factually and obviously wrong would be laughable if it wasn't so damaging in terms of the policies that came out of it. Macroeconomics, in theory, is now a different science to figure out how all of those supposedly rational individuals fit together. And why do we end up with irrational outcomes if everyone is supposedly rational? So this is the puzzle that conventional economics hasn't solved. But there are other approaches to economics that take it as given that people cooperate, but there's also conflict in society between those who have more power and wealth and those who don't. And that's how the economy is shaped, not through some kind of magic supply and demand marketplace. Very important that we understand how economics encompasses value judgments and political assumptions. They're not just describing the economy. Economics always has assumptions and conclusions about how it should function. And I'm no different. I've got my values and I've got my biases. I hope I'm a little bit more honest about them than the person who gets on TV and pretends that they're talking some kind of neutral science like physics or bouncing billiard balls off a pool table. Also, economics changes over time. The economy changes over time. Economics changes over time, and we can push and fight and contest economics. And this is part of what we need to do. Let's talk about how we measure the economy. This is an important part of the whole debate, of course. And as many people know, there's problems with how we measure it conventionally using gross domestic product or GDP. GDP is simply adding up the value that was produced through work in all of the different parts of the economy, in the public sector as well as the private sector. And the problem is it only counts the things that were produced for money. So there's lots that goes on in the economy that isn't produced for money, that is missed from GDP. And then GDP can also include things that are produced and sold for money but aren't actually useful. In fact, they might be quite destructive. Conventionally, you would adjust the measure of the size of the economy, the measure of GDP, for inflation, and that's very important as we see today. GDP is growing 10% a year, 8 or 10% a year right now. That doesn't mean we're actually doing 8 to 10% more work. Most of that increase is the result of inflation. Usually inflation is not that high. Another important adjustment is to adjust GDP for the number of people who are in the society. This is very important. Right now, we've often heard some business types and some government types say, well, we have to have bigger immigration levels to Canada in order to boost our economic growth. Now, there are good reasons to have immigration to Canada. I'm not anti-immigration at all. We need immigration, but the idea that it will boost our economic growth, or worse yet, solve a labor shortage, absolutely the wrong reason to have immigration, because you're getting more people who also have more needs for food, clothing, housing, and everything else. So this idea that just getting bigger somehow solves something is absolutely wrong. I think most folks in the meeting will understand why we have to use GDP with caution, and it should never be interpreted as a measure of well-being or progress. It does not include work that's not performed for money, including unpaid work that we do in the home and in the community. It doesn't talk about the distribution of what we produce between different people, and it doesn't consider whether the output is useful or not. So there's lots of things that add to our GDP, but don't actually add to our well-being. So GDP is relevant. I'm not saying we should ignore GDP. That would be a mistake. There's something very important in knowing how much output is produced in the economy for many reasons, including it's a key determinant of how much government revenue is collected and therefore to fund public services. But we should never assume that GDP is automatically good. Another point, we should never assume that just changing the measure would somehow change how the economy functions. This is wrong. There's an assumption that the economy is managed to maximize growth. That's absolutely wrong. The economy has not been managed to maximize growth since World War II. And it particularly has not been managed to maximize growth since the rise of neoliberalism in the late 70s and early 80s. Neoliberalism has been all about deliberately suppressing growth and keeping a lid on growth in order to ensure that there's enough unemployment around that people are desperate. Neoliberalism has managed the economy to maximize profit, not to maximize growth. Our economy would look very different today if growth was in fact the goal, and it isn't, not the way that it's managed today. Growth shouldn't be the goal, but growth is not the enemy either. If we put more people to work using their brains and brawn to produce goods and services that were useful and sustainable, and we use that output wisely, our economy would grow in terms of GDP, but that wouldn't be the goal. The goal would be human welfare, which is what the goal should be. So in that regard, how would we evaluate the economy if in fact the economy is the sum total of the work that we do to meet human needs? Well, let's just ask if it's doing it. Let's ask if human needs are being met in a fair and sustainable way. If it isn't, then the economy is not doing well. And so in this regard, again, forget about GDP. It's not about GDP. It's about health and education and safety and community and the richness of our lives, not about some abstract number. And we have to recognize there's no objective measure of this well-being. Everyone will have a different view on what they think is most important. In my book, Economics for Everyone, I have a section where I talk about how would we evaluate the economy if it's not going to be on grounds of GDP. I'm interested in people's thoughts about what your criteria would be. I think there would be some good answers if you'd like. I'm not sure if the chat has been enabled or not, but if it has been enabled, put a one-word answer in the chat in terms of what you think would be most important for evaluating the economy. In my book, Economics for Everyone, I came up with 7. Okay, I came up with 7 criteria. Are we giving people enough to live a decent life in material standards? That is important. Are we ensuring that they can be secure in that standard of living? It's no good to, be given a decent, say, middle-class standard of living, but be worried your entire life that it could be taken away from you in an instant if you lost your job or your employer went broke or your mutual fund collapsed, okay? So security has a value in its own right. Are we allowing people to be creative and to learn how to do things better? There are some things in our economy that are very innovative. There are other things that are not. Here's a good example. Look at how many people are now employed through a gig arrangement. It's a kind of a sham arrangement. It's a very unfair arrangement to ride around on bicycles delivering food to other people. The bicycle was invented in 1860. There's nothing innovative about a bicycle. Okay, so we are always told about the tech industry and .coms and everything being innovative, but in many cases they absolutely aren't. Do we have the freedom to make fundamental choices in our economic lives, not just over what toothpaste we buy, but over what kind of career we might have or where we live? Those are fundamental choices. Equality, I would say, is an absolute goal. And there's lots and lots and lots of evidence about how equality and inequality affect people's well-being. Even if you're not starving, the fact that you're poorer than other people affects your mental health and your physical health over life. Sustainability, an obvious criteria these days, because everything we do depends on things that we harvest from nature. So we have to learn how to harvest those things carefully and thoughtfully and sustainably. And we've got a long ways to go and not much time to get there. Democracy is one that I'd like to include in the criteria as well. Do we have a say in how the economy functions? Not just voting once every 4 years, but and not just choosing a different brand of toothpaste if you didn't like the one you were using. That's what Milton Friedman considers democracy, right? He said $1, one vote. I would prefer a situation where we collectively can make choices over the important economic decisions that affect our lives. So if it's not GDP, how do we evaluate how things are going? Well, there's different measures that have been taken. Lots of different genuine progress indicators or even indexes of happiness have been created. They're very interesting. One important one is the United Nations has a thing called the Human Development Index, or the HDI, and it assigns scores for each country, and you can also do it for each province within Canada, based on three things, not just one thing, but three things. One of them is the same old GDP per capita. So, you know, we haven't gotten away from GDP, and I said GDP is relevant. The measure of how much we produce in a way is showing us the possibility of using what we produce to enrich people's lives. So it's not irrelevant. They've given it a 1/3 score. Then they have life expectancy as a measure of your health, and then they have a measure of education. So they've said, you know, we won't just limit ourselves to GDP. We'll look at all three of those things and figure out how we're doing on those measures as a more balanced measurement of whether the economy is functioning or not. And when you look at even just adding in life expectancy and education, then the score of countries around the world changes considerably, because now you're looking at, to some extent, are human needs being met or not, including the human needs that you can meet through the material output of the economy, but also your education and healthcare. So this is a recent year's Human Development Index table with the different countries that are there. Norway is at the top. This is an important one for Alberta to compare itself to. Similar population, similar resource base, but boy, the Norwegians have made more good of it than we have. Canada's well down the list there at number 16. So there's Canada. We have a certain GDP per capita. They actually call it GNI, but it's more or less the same thing as GDP per capita. Not among the highest in the world, but still high. We actually, this is an interesting column here. This column in the HDI tables. What this does is compare where do you rank on GDP to where do you rank on human development. And so in a way, it's a way of measuring how much bang for the buck you're getting from your GDP. Okay, so if you ranked at the top according to GDP, but not very good according to human development, then you're going to have a negative score in this column. So in Canada's case, we rank a little bit higher for GDP, for human development. We rank 16th, whereas we would rank about 21st according to GDP. So that shows Canada's social welfare programs and other things, flawed as they are making Canada a better place to live. Look at who's right underneath us in this list, as well as right underneath us geographically, and that is the United States. The United States has much higher GDP per capita than Canada, but worse human development. And most of us know that, and we understand why, because they are not making the most of their GDP. And in fact, human conditions there in many cases are terrible. Interesting, I'm a nerd. Okay, I spend Friday nights looking at my spreadsheets and sorting the data and all that. This could explain why I don't get many dates. Okay, so anyways, I have looked at the countries in the UN's Human Development Index and identified who are the biggest overperformers and underperformers. Okay, the overperformers are countries that have very limited GDP but actually good human development. So here are the 5 biggest overperformers in the world. These are countries where they rank way higher by human development than they do by GDP. Cuba, interestingly enough, at the top of that list. So their GDP is actually pretty low, but their human development measured by education, literacy, life expectancy, healthcare, very high. Other countries that you wouldn't expect to be overperformers, interesting. It just makes you think a bit. I'm not endorsing any of these countries, but I am saying it does make you think. What is it about some countries that they're able to get more good, if you like, out of the GDP that's produced. Here are the greatest underperformers. These are countries that rank high by GDP, but terrible by human development. And a lot of them are petrostates. Okay, Equatorial Guinea is the worst underperformer, a country that has among the highest GDP per capita in the African continent, but run by a brutal dictatorship, and the people are starving. So interesting lesson here for Alberta as well. Natural resource wealth doesn't translate into prosperity unless we create the political and democratic mechanisms to ensure that it does. Otherwise, we'll be like another Equatorial Guinea or Kuwait or Qatar. Let's talk a little bit about the particular kind of economy that we live in. I'm going to mention the C word here, capitalism. As soon as you say capitalism, you sound like some kind of dangerous Bolshevik getting ready to, throw a bomb. You know, those funny old-fashioned black round bombs with a fuse on top? It seems like that's what you're about to say. As soon as you say the word capitalism, you hardly ever hear the word capitalism. In fact, you could go through a whole 4-year degree in economics and not hear the word capitalism, because they don't like to call it that. They call it a market economy, or they just call it the economy, as if there's no other imaginary form, no other conceivable form of the economy. What I've said about economics so far is true of every economy. It's always dependent on our brains and our brawn and the human labor that we produce to produce goods and services from the resources we harvest from nature. That's been true of every kind of economy. But the way you organize that work and how you distribute the output is done differently in different economic systems. And our economies have evolved over that 200,000 years, and they've evolved rapidly over the last couple centuries. And we do it in a peculiar way. And it is an irony that you almost never hear this word. They would prefer that you didn't name it. They would prefer that you conclude it's the natural state of affairs. So why give the natural state of affairs a term? You're almost assuming that therefore it can change. And that they don't want us to think it can change. So that's wrong. We should study economic history. Economic history is a fundamentally subversive subject because it teaches you that economies do change. And that means the economy we live in today is not at all set in stone. What I call a capitalist economy has two fundamental defining features. One is that most of the work that's done in the economy, not all, about 85% of it in Canada's case, is undertaken by private companies doing it for profit, production for profit. So that's an interesting point. Secondly, most of the work that's done, again, not all, but most of it is done by people who are employed by someone else to do the work. And they're paid a wage or salary or tips or a commission or a little bit that's left over on your app if you work for Uber. You're paid something to do the work for someone else. And this is called employment or wage labor. This is a more narrow category than work. Work is a generic category, which means I'm using my brains and brawn to do something productive. Interesting problem. As soon as you organize an economy where most work is organized in order to generate a profit for someone, you're no longer doing it to meet human needs. And I just defined the purpose of the economy as to meet human needs. Some things that are done for profit are meeting human needs. Many of them are not. And many of the ways we could meet human needs are not profitable, and therefore we don't do them. And this is the kind of fundamental problem in how we've organized the economy today. I want to talk about one last kind of bit of mythology about how the economy functions and how we put people at the center of the economy. And that's this idea that workers are disposable and someday soon will be replaced with machines. And I want to keep people at the center of my economics, not machines. The fact is, in my definition, work cannot disappear. It is absolutely impossible that humans in a generic sense could be disposed of in the economy. Our capacity to work, our brains and brawn, and transform what we harvest from nature into useful goods and services is the driving force of everything we do in the economy. And even if we move to a more automated system where you use more tools and you use more machinery, you still have human labor in there. You're just doing the human labor at a different place in the whole production chain, okay? So we're still starting with natural resources and our ability to work, but now the first thing we do is we produce a tool, okay? It could be as simple as an axe head that we hammered out of a rock, a piece of flint, or it could be something as complex as a million-line computer code running an AI application, but it's a tool. And then we take our labor and probably some more resources, even just to energy, and use that tool to produce the end product. And with automation, all you're doing is doing more of the work at the intermediate stage and less at the final stage. You're doing less work at the final stage with your bare hands, and you're doing more work using tools, but it's still human beings. There would be no machines without human beings to conceive of the machines, engineer them, manufacture them, install them, operate them, and fix them when they break. So automation or no automation, human labor is still the essential input. I just have to wave my arms there again. That's the other energy saving light system I have. Oh my God. So the reality is we have not seen humans displaced by machines in any kind of aggregate way ever, even going back to the Industrial Revolution. And I think that I'm not saying that we should just accept technology. I'm saying that we should fight to shape and manage and regulate technology so that we use this capacity, the knowledge, the combined knowledge that we've developed in all that time to work better, produce more and better stuff, and then use that stuff to actually meet human needs. And there's all kinds of reasons why work is not going to disappear. And I think that the fear that we're all going to be replaced by robots is manipulated by the people in charge so that we start blaming the robots instead of blaming them. There's no doubt that we're going to have disruption in different occupations and industries as technology advances, but there's also no doubt that nothing can happen without human labor. And we saw that, saw a terrifying glimpse of that during the COVID pandemic when whole industries were shut down and we all had to stay home. All of a sudden, the economy ground to a halt. And that was a frightening reminder that human beings are in fact the engine of the economy and the only thing that adds value to the resources that we harvest from nature. So Bob, I have taken up a lot of time. I'm grateful for everyone's attention and patience. I'm looking forward to the discussion, but I just want to conclude by saying we have got both a necessity and an opportunity to define a vision of an economy where we use our brains and brawn, where we work, but we produce stuff that makes sense. We interact with nature sustainably, and then we use what we produce to build a better society and a better planet. And I am as optimistic as I have ever been, despite the challenges that we face, from rampaging populists and the power of vested interests. I'm as optimistic as I've ever been that vision of an economy with people at the center of it and us collectively fighting to have our collective interests at the top of that economic agenda. I'm as optimistic as I've ever been that that's possible. And Parkland is helping make that possible. So thank you again for what you do.
Well, and thank you very much, Jim, for that very stimulating and hopeful talk. I think it's very important to remember to put the person in the economy rather than the economy on top of the person. So now let's turn to this evening's panel. Marliss Taylor is our first panelist, and she is the manager of Streetworks and director of health services at the Boyle Street Community Services in Edmonton. Marliss is a registered nurse who has been active nationally and internationally. She's worked in harm reduction for the past 27 years. She was the first to initiate the use of community-based naloxone in Canada in 2005. She's a member of the Alberta Health Services Board of Directors from 2015 to 2019 and was a member of the Minister's Opioid Emergency Response and is the chair of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. And Ms. Taylor is both a fan of cats and dogs and horses as well. Now, our second panelist was to be Crystal Lameman, and she's a mother of two and proud member of the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, Treaty 6, where she currently works as a government relations advisor and as a treaty coordinator. The email that I received today, I'll just read very briefly. Today is my nation's leadership inauguration and swearing in ceremony. I was alerted at noon today that I was expected to be at this ceremony. I tried to get out of it, but it was last minute. And so I apologize for that. She goes on. However, I highly recommend you all read Shailene Jobin's new book, Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships, Nihayawak Narratives. My speaking notes were based on this book and my newly co-authored book, The End of the World, Climate Justice and So-Called Canada. Now, Mark Anielski is a well-respected economist, and he has operated his family-owned economic consultancy since 1995. He lives in the same area that I do, and we occasionally join coffee. He consults with several First Nations across Canada on building new economies of well-being. His mastery is measuring happiness, a point that Jim was talking about just a few minutes ago, well-being and economic progress. He has lectured and taught well-being economics at Harvard, the Harbin Institute of Technology, and the School of Business in Innsbruck, Austria. He served as an economic advisor to China in their efforts to adapt new measures of well-being and happiness, and is the author of the award-winning book, The Economics of Happiness and an Economy of Well-Being. He lives in Edmonton, Alberta, with his family. And I know, Mark, you're a dog person, but you have come to love cats. So let's begin our panel discussion with Marliss.
Thank you very much, Bob. And Jim, thanks so much for that presentation. It was really, really excellent in terms of thinking about sort of the broader picture. And I have to say, a number, probably five or 6 points came to mind for me. Now, I work in a population that is homeless, houseless, that has zero financial means in many ways, which means talking about the economy is quite different. The folks that I work with can't participate really in the mainstream economy, and their human needs are not being met in that group. A lot of times, there are so many barriers that work is not even a possibility for them. But what I'm always struck by is how many people who do work look upon this population with such scorn and resentment and anger. And it actually puts more barriers between these folks moving to a place of greater stability and perhaps finding a place to live and getting a job. Rather than supporting people, we tend to just put them further and further behind, attitudinally, certainly, sometimes through the actions. And, it just strikes me lately, a number of services have been decreased. The homeless population in Edmonton is sitting at about 3,000. One of the big responses is about more policing as opposed to more housing or more ways of helping people actually become participants in the economy. What I do see every day is an underground economy, and that one is really interesting. It's how people who have nothing survive. I watch, they trade different things all the time. It's favors for each other. Hey, if you can do this, then I'll do this for you. Sometimes it's about protection. Look, I'll take care of you if you blah, blah, blah. Sometimes there's abuse involved in some of that, and certainly some of that by more mainstream employers, where we often see people, they'll come and pick up people to go and work for the day, and then at the end of the day, they don't pay them. They just kick them out of the car and drive away. It's very frustrating. But then there's also lots of services if someone is sick. And, an example from that recently is we've been hit in the downtown core with the Shigella outbreak. And Shigella is a very bad gastrointestinal illness. And the community itself in several places created a sick tent. So they created their own hospital, and then they had, they took care of each other. People would go and get stuff for people to some water to drink, try and keep hydrated, try and do all of that, get them to a physician if that's what helps. So I think there are different kinds of economies, as you say, but the one that's outside of the mainstream economy saves lives probably more than what the others do. I mean, what I've always found is that poor people are the most generous people that there are, and they will give you anything because they know what it's like to have absolutely nothing. I think I also find that the systems perpetuate this lack of participation in the economy. It perpetuates poverty. It just perpetuates poor health. It increases justice system involvement. It doesn't help. It creates a situation where families are basically torn apart. It almost encourages racism and stigma, substance use and mental health issues, and it really leads to premature death and high levels of disability. And I think I've never understood this, and I don't understand why we can't help everybody do better. So a really concrete example that I can tell you about is one of the programs that we run is the pregnancy program, the Her Pregnancy program. It is to give supports to women while they are pregnant or for the first 6 months postpartum. And what we know, and the way it's always been set up in Alberta, is that if you are homeless and pregnant, you cannot get social assistance until your last trimester. So what that means is you're standing in soup lines, or you're eating out of garbage cans, or you're getting a sandwich here and there. You might be actually living in a dumpster or a recycle bin. Certainly we've had pregnant women doing that. You can get social assistance if you have a physician that will write you a note, but it's surprising how many physicians also have bought into the idea that you should work. So somehow there is a feeling that even though you are perhaps racialized, you're living in a dumpster, you have nothing to eat, you have no maternity clothes, you have no transportation, you have no clock, you have nothing, you should go and work. And then they will refuse sometimes to write those notes. And I am stunned that we expect that we're going to have a healthy family at the end of this, or even a healthy woman or healthy infant at the end. So the systems just seem to continually make it worse and worse. I looked at your evaluation criteria that you spoke about: prosperity, security, innovation, choice, equality, sustainability, and democracy. And it's really challenging, again, in the segment of population that I work within all the time. Many of those aren't doable at all in the crowd that we're in. And I think the last thing that I wanted to think about is that, having an income, here I'm thinking about the staff that work for me. We have a lot of staff that come from the homeless community that over time, have reached this stage of stability, and boy, you bet, come and work with us. We're really thrilled to have that happen. But we have some people who have come from a more mainstream background, and they would all get the same salary. But the pressures on the folks that have come from the vulnerable community means that income is way different. It means so many different things to our staff who are surrounded in their family and friends of people who are poor or living on the edge or who are homeless. So the purchase power for them goes way, way down, because there's a certain amount of sharing that has to happen, and taking care of people, and sometimes they're the only person in their whole family who works or who has worked. So I'm always struck by that inequity. Even though the income is the same, the stresses and the pressures and the responsibilities are quite different for some rather than others. And I think I'm going to stop there. I could only speak about what I know, and this is what I know is what's going on with the folks who don't participate in the current economy. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Marliss. I'm going to put this book up in front of my face. It's called Gigs, Hustles, and Temps. It's recently came out, published by Lorimer and Sons, and our own Jason Foster has produced a very readable book, and does speak, I think, Marliss, to the precariousness of employment and the difficulties that people face on a daily basis, and the health concerns and health issues. And it also speaks to Jim's point about security in his list of indicators, key indicators. So I thought I would just shamelessly plug the director of Parkland's book on air here. But now I'd like to ask Mark Anielski to provide some comments. Mark?
Thanks, Bob. I just want to say, Jim, I wish you were my macroeconomics professor at the U of A. I might have learned something. But it took me 20 years to get over the trauma of all the mathematical abstractions of reality. So thanks for reminding us that economics is about the household stewardship. That's what it means in Greek. And so my work has focused on well-being for quite a while. And, you know, in 2007, The Economics of Happiness, I published just before the crash. And originally it was just going to be called, my colleague Bill Craig's online here from Toronto, and the idea came from my students at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute in Seattle area to write a book about what I was teaching them, and similar to what, Jim, you've shared, that you know, the etymological roots of the words, a language in economics and business. So that, you know, the word wealth comes from the Old English. It means the conditions of well-being. And the word happiness from the Greek eudaimonia, which means well-being of spirit, well-being of soul. And we go on and on: competition to strive together, education meaning to draw forth what's already within you. So based on this kind of reestablishment of the essence, the true spirit and intent of language, led me to then propose a new accounting structure that actually, as Bobby Kennedy said in 1968, measures the things that makes life worthwhile. And certainly my work in the Genuine Progress Indicator, which I did for the US back in 1999, and then for Alberta, and that got maligned by all my former employees and bosses at finance or treasury, and for not being mature enough and you know, to audacious to measure actually the well-being conditions of the province. And my reflection on this long journey, it's 23 years now of trying to advance this well-being economy idea, is that it's the kind of tone deafness of politicians, and I'm going to name every politician in this regard, to what seems to be just a common sense platform. How could you not campaign on a platform of happiness, of thriving, of well-being? I just don't get it. And it doesn't matter who's in power. And even the Liberal government did propose that we adopt finance. In fact, in the 2000 budget said we should incorporate well-being into budgeting decision-making. And I totally applauded that. But the fact that it made Appendix 4 in an 800-page budget document, which to me said, and I've helped write budget speeches, says that Canada wasn't really that serious about really adopting. So the question is, what is the threat of making well-being the central organizing feature of economies? Now, the good news, I'll switch scenes to Marliss's reality too. And, you know, in 2018, I wrote An Economy of Well-being because people said, Mark, this is too theoretical. Write another book about how to. So my handbook. And ironically, my publisher just contacted me and said, Mark, we're sorry your book sales on this book aren't high enough, so we're going to just shred all your books that are in circulation, right? It's like, what? But the good news about this is that guess who loves the idea? First Nations. And so I've switched completely gears from hoping that cities and even nations would adopt the well-being idea to First Nations, the First Peoples. And why do they get it? So my first work was with the Beaver Cree Nation in the Paw, Manitoba. Chief bought my book, Chief Christian Sinclair, at the Indigenomics Conference, the first Indigenomics Conference. I was part of helping establish Indigenomics with Caroline Hilton in Victoria. So the next day he calls me and says, I want to bring you to the Paw. And I said, the Paw is the most racist place in Canada. And he goes, I know, but I love your ideas. And I want you to come and tell my community how we can adopt your ideas and maybe even create a well-being bank. And I was like, all right, let's do this. So, I'm a pragmatist. I know these things are possible, and maybe it will take First Nations to lead that way. And so since 2019, before the pandemic hit, I've now done Comox First Nation, comprehensive well-being assessment on Vancouver Island. It'll be the first modern treaty to be based on well-being. And what's so special about them? StatsCan, they're all, and Indigenous Service Canada can't believe that members of the community completed a well-being survey, which I conduct, and it has people self-assess their mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being based on the medicine wheel teachings. And I got 85% of households. As I said, StatsCan, you can't get that response rate on your census, I know, because a lot of people have dogs, so you can't even get the enumerator to get to the front door. But so I love working with First Nations. They're teaching me not only their traditional teachings, but well-being just resonates with their whole sense of creation, the relationship with nature. And so in 2001, during COVID, the largest independent media outlet in Ireland hired me to conduct the comprehensive well-being survey of all of Ireland. And they said, can you do the North too? And I said, absolutely. And we had so much fun. We had such amazing results. We mapped the well-being index based on 36 questions across every county in Ireland. And the most amazing thing I discovered of all the questions we asked, including life satisfaction, joy, how you sleep at night, your trust of neighbors, the top scoring indicator was a sense of belonging to my community in spite of religion, race, and gender. That was the top. I went, that should make international headlines because Ireland is okay. So what I'm working on now is, I'm now chief economist with, I've been chief economist with Treaty 8 nations here in Alberta. I'm now the health economist with Treaty 6. I work with the Robinson Huron Treaty Nations in Ontario. Yesterday announcement, $10 billion new settlement. I worked on that piece with, alongside with Joseph Stiglitz, the great economist. So very, very happy to see amazing progress. And ultimately, my aspiration, and it's working in certain nations, is to incorporate well-being into all policy decision makings, into budgeting, and making the case that well-being return on investment can be the basis of demonstrating value for taxes and value for money. And the last thing I'll say is my biggest dream is to create the first well-being bank in the world, based on a public banking model, which includes, I know Bob and I are fans of Alberta Treasury Branch and the Bank of North Dakota. And I'm like, First Nations, you can do this because you're sitting on unceded territory in which the assets called the oil sands and the forests should be on your balance sheet, even if they're not on the balance sheet of the province or of Canada. And these are exciting times to restore the spirit of Kanata, of Turtle Island, and help to heal all the trauma that Marliss, has to deal with every day. I mean, it's terrible but I think this is the right approach, and I only wish that there would be some enlightened politicians that could have the courage to do what some of the First Nations are doing. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark and Marliss. I think there's some technical issues that are coming up in terms of messaging to the chat, and so we'll try and work through those because we're not getting too many questions from the audience yet. Now, Jim, I wonder if you might have a few remarks or reflections on what Marliss and Mark said just now.
Oh, Bob, I'm just grateful for their comments and for the hard work that they're doing in Marliss's case with folks who have suffered terribly because of how our economy is mismanaged, and trying to do what you can with so few resources to bring some support and health and solidarity to them. And Mark, that's amazing work that you're doing with the survey research and the actual concrete accounting that you're doing, including with First Nations. So I think that you know, in a way, we've just had two examples of people trying to build a different economy with people at the center of it in different ways. And I'm inspired and grateful for your efforts.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim.
And Mark, you and I could have suffered through macroeconomics together. I think it would have been nice to have a fellow sufferer while we got fed all that nonsense.
All those second derivative formulas that made no sense at all. Explain the labor market. Come on.
So let's open it up for questions. And I had a few questions based on some of the comments that were made by Jim. I found in particular Jim's reference to economic history as subversive to be very interesting point. In particular, his reference to the words capitalism not being allowed in the classroom, so to speak. But one of the questions we had from the audience has to do with a basic annual income and the notion of work. And it seems to me in our political economic system, job number one for politicians seems to be creating jobs. And in Alberta, it's particularly the elephant investments that we've seen happen, and not anything happening at the community level, Jim. And at the community level where a job is not just a paycheck, but that there's some purpose and some meaning to the work. So, and this is a challenge, I think, of any government, is how to give people an opportunity to work. So any reflections on sort of the current system, which seems to be, well, give Volkswagen $13 billion and Stellantis $5 billion, and give oil companies billions of dollars in tax credits to build carbon capture. Can you maybe provide a different vision of that world, to that world?
Yeah, sure, Bob. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning the failure of sort of the trickle-down vision of economics to create work where it's needed. And you're absolutely right. I mean, they have given billions of dollars to, in Alberta's case, to oil companies and others through whether it's actual subsidies or handouts or just reductions in the tax rate. I know we had a debate in Alberta in the last election about what should the provincial corporate tax rate be. And the assumption being that if you raised it, you'd scare away all this investment. And the amazing thing is that trickle-down economics hasn't even worked for developing new investment, let alone creating jobs and prosperity flowing from that investment. In fact, I'm going to abuse my position here, Bob, and actually just put up a couple of slides I had in another context here. Whoops, I've gone to the wrong one there. Just a second here. Here's some data on Alberta's economic performance under the UCP's first term in government. So this is in the 4 years ending 2022, just before the election. And this is a measure of job creation relative to the working age population. So just like GDP, you have to adjust it for population. You have to do the same with the number of jobs that you're creating. Adjust it for the size of the population and how is the working age population growing. here we've had this whole idea that the trickle-down philosophy of lower corporate taxes. Oh, there goes my lights at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock now. I'll go and get that in a second. Lower corporate taxes, deregulation, privatizing public services, and suppressing wages. That's been a big piece of the Alberta trickle-down model, would somehow unleash entrepreneurial energy and investment and job creation. Well, here we have it. This is the change in the employment rate over the term of the UCP's first period in office, and Alberta was the absolute worst of any of the provinces. Astounding. Here's the NDP-run BC right next door with high corporate taxes and growing public sector, and in fact, better job creation. So, you know, that's just one vignette. We pulled together some information through the Alberta Federation of Labor and other outlets on the other measures of economic performance. But there is this mythology that what's good for business is good for the economy, or what's good for business is good for us. And if you actually look at the data in Alberta's case, there's no doubt that what the government did was good for business. Profits increased immensely in Alberta, in part because of skyrocketing energy prices that we pay for, by the way, but also in part because of all the government measures to suppress wages and cut corporate taxes. So on top of all that, it didn't work. It didn't actually lead to more investment. Alberta's share of investment in Canada fell, not grew, under lower corporate taxes. So this is where I think developing a model of a more balanced economy that includes public investment as well as private investment, that puts a direct target on job creation, particularly in the communities like the ones that Marliss serves, as the actual goal, not just a side effect, okay, of business activity, can actually lead to better outcomes. And there's lots of contrast between Alberta and BC right next door under two very different policy visions. And BC's economy, by every measure, has done significantly better than Alberta's. I'm going to run and turn my lights back on.
Bob, you're mute.
Thanks, Mark. Typically, the biggest bang for the buck from corporate tax cuts went to the Big Four. Now, I've got a question from the audience, Marliss, for you. But do you think the ideal of a guaranteed annual income would be helpful for the populations you work with? And that is something maybe Jim and Mark would want to weigh in on as well.
Well, as I understand the bit that I know about the concept that's been done in a few other places, I think, you know, that they've shown lots of positives from it. Here's what I think. If you have absolutely nothing, then yes, absolutely, having some kind of an income will make a difference. That not one that you have to, you know, the hoops that you have to jump through to get on social assistance, for example. It's just incredibly complicated and barriered. But having a guaranteed income, then getting people so that at least they have some options of some kind, because right now for many there are none. Their option is a tent or a tarp somewhere. That should not, we're in Canada, for God's sakes, we're in Edmonton, you know, how can this even be happening? So yeah, I'm no economist, but I certainly think that having some kind of a guaranteed income would make good sense.
Jim, I'm sure you thought quite deeply about this subject.
I have, for sure, Bob, and I've published a little bit on our Center for Future Work website about this. I'm a great believer in guaranteed income support for Canadians. Anybody who needs it should absolutely get a level of support that is, you know, not starvation, but enough to meet the basics of life. And again, we had an interesting natural experiment in this during the COVID pandemic with the CERB benefits and everything else. You know, they were expensive, but they were important and critical to helping people stay in their homes. And guess what? Irony of ironies, in the middle of a giant pandemic, poverty fell dramatically in Canada because more people could get $2,000 a month on the CERB or some of the other benefits that were like it. So we should absolutely be strengthening income support at all stages of life. We've done that very well at the over 65 population. Poverty among seniors is quite small in Canada, not perfect. We still have more work to do, but quite small. We've done it very well at the under 18 stage of life. Child poverty in Canada has fallen dramatically. It's a huge achievement since the introduction of the Canada Child Tax Benefit. And we could do better at the intermediary stage as well by, first of all, fixing our EI system, fixing provincial welfare programs to get rid of the punitive judgmentalism of it all, implementing this disability benefit that has been talked about but not acted on. That would be a kind of guaranteed annual income for people with disabilities. Just a couple of cautionary notes. I am told from time to time that we have to have a basic income because all of our jobs are going to disappear from robots. Okay, and this is one where we just have to say, no, that's not how it's going to happen. And that's not an argument for basic income. Because, you know, if all our jobs disappeared, who would be producing the stuff that people would try to buy with a basic income? Of course not. So our jobs are not going to disappear, and we shouldn't view basic income as an alternative in some kind of work-free world. There won't be a work-free world. And the only way that society could afford a basic income is if most people weren't using it, if most people were still working and producing, and then we use the basic income for people who couldn't find a stable place in that working economy. So with that caveat, I think it's a wonderful idea, and we've actually had some experiments that prove it works.
Whereabouts, Jim? What pilot projects or countries has this worked in?
Oh, well, I was referring to the different places in Canada that have basic income type policies, like the GIS is a basic income for people over 65, the child tax benefit for people under 18. But there are places in the world that have done experiments with basic income. A very powerful one was in India, where basic incomes were provided in very poor rural communities. And in fact, the interesting point was labor force participation went up in India when this basic income was provided, in part because people could afford some of the basics that are necessary in order to work, like clothes to go to work in and a cell phone to communicate with, and so on. So the old adage, the old knee-jerk argument that you can't give people income security or they won't have a work ethic, absolutely wrong. Same in Canada with the whole idea of the CERB. The CERB was paid out, and our labor force participation is higher than it's ever been. So in that regard, I think there's a lot of mythology out there.
Okay. Mark, any thoughts?
Well, I've done, in my survey work, I'm curious about the relationship between subjective well-being and income. And, you know, I've got about 3,200 people who've taken my survey over the last 3 years. So I've got some big data, and it does show that, you know, this relationship between a happiness income or a living wage income and well-being, there is a correlation, and those who, you know, earn less than the poverty line or below even the living wage line have lower well-being conditions. Now with First Nations, it's not necessarily true, which is itself interesting because income seems to be less important. But still, I could definitely see, you know, households who are making 30,000 or less are struggling in some areas of well-being. And so that's important to me because I can tell chief and council there's X percentage your members who are struggling and have lower levels of well-being. And the interesting concept then, and we know the experiment in Dauphin, Manitoba was probably the only experiment of a guaranteed income, and the data at the time suggested it was working. So the work I'm doing with the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, the PA right now, is trying to conceive of a notion where every family would have some type of living wage uplift above, you know, to achieve a living wage, and thereby be able to live a Cree way of life, which is all, you know, family oriented. So it'll be an experiment that will be forthcoming.
Another
Can I just
question
mention,
from,
can I just mention
oh,
two
sorry,
quick,
Marliss. Yeah,
no, that's fine. Just two really quick thoughts on this. One is, and I remember one of the medical officers of health talking to me saying, you can talk about income, but we're a fixed income, but when it's given to the women in a family rather than men, it actually gets spent in a way that's more productive for a family. And I honestly don't know what his reference is. But the other thing is this idea that there is any sort of an equity in some areas. So what we know is that if a family in the mainstream decides to be a foster family for a child, they're going to get about 5 times more than what a woman who actually gave birth and is trying to raise that child. And so there are some real inequities within those systems.
okay. Here's a question for you, Mark, and I think you'll smile when you hear it. It's about Bhutan and their GDP and their experience as a nation that has brought well-being into a centerpiece, as I understand it, of government planning.
Well, yes, thank you for that question. Everyone loves to point to Bhutan, and I often burst the romantic bubble about Bhutan because I've sat with the Prime Minister of the UN in 2012 when the UN Prime Minister, or the Bhutanese Prime Minister, encouraged in front of the Secretary General all the world to adopt an economy of well-being. And I think Bhutan definitely has been a leader with their Buddhist monarch. And interesting, my observation is, it's a homogeneous culture. It's a Buddhist nation, has a wonderful, benevolent king, but it can also be quite racist and exclusionary of others. So what I find fascinating is if we, the Bhutanese can be a good model, but if Canada can adopt this with such a diverse culture and ethnic culture, we certainly should be the model of the world and by far the happiest nation. But I applaud Bhutan for at least committing to consistently measuring happiness. They use a very comprehensive survey of households. I bugged, Finance Canada during COVID. I said, you could ask some of the same questions I'm asking First Nations. It won't take very long to fill out the survey, but nobody asks these common sense questions of how you feel, how you sleep at night, how much joy do you have in your life? Just common sense questions. And so bravo to Bhutan, but not enough nations have really embraced their kind of leadership.
Okay, here's a question for all. Have you noticed any political candidates that are doing actions and serious work in introducing a well-being economy? And we'll start with Marliss and then end up with Mark, because I have some supplementary questions for Mark.
Oh boy. I'm really good at pointing out who's not doing that.
Okay.
I think that there's all kinds of different levels of government, and I see champions sort of at every level. But it's sort of scattered around, and so I think probably I will defer this question to the much more aware gentleman.
Jim?
None of us are more aware than you, Marliss, of what the economy is all about and where it's gone wrong. So I still bow to your expertise on the human side of all of this. The reality is, Bob, we force our governments, even right-wing governments, to do things that help to address a well-being society. There's no doubt about that. So it's not a utopian thing. We see it around us, even in Alberta today. We've got public schools, we've got public health care, we've got parks, we've got commitments to public space. They aren't enough, and the government that's in power now is degrading them. But those things are there, and they've made a huge difference to people's quality of life. We don't need a kind of magical utopia. I mean, even though I started the utopia thing with my unicorn selection at the beginning. We just need more of the good things that are potentially around us. And so for sure, that last election in Alberta was a lot about how many of those good things are we going to get versus how much faith are we going to put in trickle down economics? And it wasn't neither it wasn't a a polarized thing in one sense, that there was good things and bad things in both of the main parties. And the NDP had a fair amount of trickle down economics built into some of their arguments. There's no doubt about that. I think they accepted way too much of that false logic that we have to have the lowest corporate taxes in Canada. The level of corporate taxes in Alberta was irrelevant to what's happened in Alberta in the last 4 years, and somebody should have come out and said that. But at any rate, there was clear choices to be made in terms of how much resources were going to go into healthcare and education and environmental protection and so on. So we can look around the world using the Human Development Index or the happiness rankings or any of the other things and see where things are being done better and where human welfare is being promoted more. So interesting to note, on many of those indexes, including the HDI that I showed or the economics of happiness, the Scandinavian countries or the Nordic countries always rise to the top of these indexes because they have taxes that are equivalent to 45 or 50% of their GDP. They spend that taxes on things that support people from cradle to grave. And they've built a sense of trust. I'm interested to learn lately, as we see populism rampaging and trying to dismantle social capital and dismantle our democracy, the places where people are actually happy are places where people still have trust in the validity and integrity of public institutions. And again, the Nordic countries rise to the top on that score. So it isn't a utopian exercise to say we should shift the economy so that we're putting more emphasis and more resources on the things that actually meet human needs and dispense with the bullshit, there's that technical term again, about how enriching the people at the top will make us all better off somehow. That's not how it works.
Right. And Mark, you've had the most experience, as you described in your presentation, with both government officials, the bureaucratic and the political level. So I also am aware that you were on the provincial audit committee of the government of Alberta for 4 years, and at that time you, I believe, attempted to bring the notion of well-being and the accounting work behind that to at least to some forum to discuss it. Can you perhaps share some of your experiences on that and some of the obstacles and pitfalls?
Oh, I'd love to, because I'm not running for office and I have no political risk at all. But so let me just first say that it was Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who at the World Economic Forum, I think in 2019, was the first to announce New Zealand's going to adopt a well-being based approach to the economy. And it was under female leadership in Scotland and Iceland and Finland that we saw then the leadership from women leaders on this idea. Now Jacinda's gone. Trudeau flirted with it. But I have to say, I've addressed almost all political parties in Alberta at some point in the last 10 years, including the Alberta Party, the New Democratic Party, when Jack Layton was around. And I'd be most impressed actually with the Green Party, young Jordan Wilk, I think is his name, a firefighter who interviewed me for hours about how to adopt these ideas. And I said, well, if anyone could be trusted as a firefighter, but of course the Greens didn't do very well either. But my disappointment was actually, and I say this with great love and kindness because Rachel Notley is my backdoor neighbor, is that the ideas that I was hoping could be brought forward in a practical way, because I'm a performance measurement guy, could have been adopted by her government. And, you know, in great respect for Joe Ceci, who's a social worker, there was really no, I think, understanding of how to execute the ideas and bring them into budgeting processes. Now, so I would say, well, great, again, respect that, you know, certainly checked all the boxes of the election promises, but the opportunity to make Alberta a shining light on the hill as a model of a well-being economy, I think, has come and gone. And so now we just have a lot of, and even during the election campaign, word well-being economy wasn't even on anyone's lips. And yet, I think it does still represent an enormously important opportunity for Alberta to take a lead. And I don't have much hope in Canada anymore, because Canada, Trudeau's just dropped the ball on it, in my opinion. So,
Marliss, did you want to add something?
No, I'm good,
No.
thanks.
Okay. Now here's a challenging question for Jim Stanford. Let me just get that up. I would challenge Jim that humans are not displaced. I have been displaced from work twice in my career by automation, going on to paying for re-education with my retirement income to become employed again. Could you explain your point in that context? So this is the whole business about robots is going to take over the world. So what do we do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Bob, that's a very fair point, and I think maybe I sped through what I was trying to say in that. I certainly wasn't suggesting that individuals are never displaced. They clearly are. People are displaced for all kinds of reasons in an economy where most of the work that's done is paid employment or wage labor. This is just a fundamental insecurity of living in a capitalist economy for most people. They depend on someone else to give them the opportunity to work for income to support themselves. And people get displaced because the company went broke. They got displaced because the company moved somewhere else. They got displaced because people stopped buying what they produce. And they get displaced in some cases for technology. So there are clearly industries where individuals at a particular stage of production have been replaced by machines. The point I was getting at was that in a generic macroeconomic sense, that's not possible. Okay, in the economy writ large, the job that disappeared because of a machine at that particular place has a job that ended up being created somewhere else in the whole chain. And this is why we've never experienced mass technological unemployment in the history of capitalism. It's never happened, even though workers have been afraid of that happening. It has never happened, and there are reasons why it has never happened. So in that regard, my goal is to say the issue is not technology per se. The issue is who controls the technology and how is it used and how are the costs and benefits of it shared. And in that regard, part of a vision of an economy with people at the center of it, but that uses technology where it can be helpful to produce more and better goods and produce more efficiently and produce more sustainably. Part of that is fighting through our communities, through our democratic system, through our trade unions, to exert more influence over how technology unfolds and how it's used. So I certainly didn't mean to imply that no one has been displaced by technology. It certainly has happened, as people have been displaced for any other reason, when the profit-making interests of the employer cause them to decide they don't need you anymore. That's the problem with this mode of doing work.
Okay, thank you for that, Jim. Now, this whole concept about economic well-being and the conventional wisdom, which is that the economy is everything and it's about getting money as the sole purpose of survival, basically, in our society. So how do we begin to teach these concepts in our schools? Mark, any thoughts? Were you at all involved in this curriculum review under the NDP and advancing that kind of notion?
No, but I was actually, I worked on the Inspiring Education framework for Dave Hancock when he was education minister. And I was a smart ass who asked the question, what does the word education actually come from? And none of the folks, including deans of education, knew. I said, okay, smart aleck, look it up in the etymological dictionary. And so we came up with a pretty amazing platform in which I argued that if we took an Indigenous view of education, the true's definition, to draw forth what's already within inside you. That's what it means. And we took a medicine wheel view of the child, of the learner, we would have a different education system. And you know what the outcome of that was? The co-chair at the time said, we don't want any images, we don't want any indigenous images of medicine wheels and all that stuff. And that's way before I started working for Nations. So I'm just blathering on to say I have no comment on what the NDP did in terms of the curriculum change. But I think if we had adopted the spirit and intent of inspiring education, which happened under Hancock, I think, and an Indigenous approach to learning.
Right.
Interesting province.
So we're beginning to run short of time, and we'll have a few more questions. One for Jim. Given that governments are motivated by neoliberal ideas and their primary goal is to attract capital at the expense of social services, and this was clearly the agenda for Taves and for Kenny when they brought in the Open for Business Alberta and various kinds of legislation to reduce corporate taxes. Now, Jim, how optimistic are you that Canada will be able to maintain or advance its position in the HDI rankings?
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Anupam. I saw who that question came from. Great to have you on this session, Anupam. And the Parkland and all the progressive folks have to make the most use possible. Anupam Das, a professor of economics at Mount Royal University, and a very important progressive voice in our community. That is actually a great excuse for me to put up a couple more slides. Because just as assumption that the goal is to attract capital, I'm not sure that that's actually what they're doing. Okay, so here's another slide. This is something, again, we pulled together as part of our brief for the Alberta Federation of Labor in the last election. This shows investment in Alberta over the last 45 years, including in the period since the UCP came in and cut the corporate tax rate in the province. And, you know, lo and behold, it's going up and then it's going down. So the corporate tax cut in Alberta has been associated with a decline in investment. So that's where I say this, the whole chain of logic in trickle-down economics is broken from the very first chain. The very first chain, link in the chain, the very first link in the chain is make rich people richer and they'll invest more, and then all these other things will unfold. And we can critique whether those things are going to unfold or not from investment. They didn't even get the investment. You actually saw less investment as a share of GDP in Alberta under these corporate taxes. In fact, the lowest as a share of GDP since we started gathering these statistics after World War II. And we know this is happening because the oil companies are making a shitload of money. That's a technical term in economics, Bob. Shitload of money means superfluous profitability, okay? And they are not reinvesting it for the most part. Partly because, you know, the big oil sands plants are finished, but they also know that oil is going to disappear as an energy source. So they're paying out gazillions of dollars in dividends, buying back gazillions of dollars worth of shares, and they are not reinvesting it. So the corporate tax cut did absolutely nothing. And here is this is Alberta's share of total business investment in Canada. So it actually declined by more as a share of GDP than, more as a share of total investment in Canada than any other province. And there's BC right next to it again. Look at that. BC, where the provincial tax rate is, I think, 12%, not 8%, and not even the 11% that the NDP was going to raise it to in Alberta. And they are growing their share of investment in Canada in large part because of some huge public investment programs or public-private investment programs, including in infrastructure, publicly owned electricity, and of course, social programs. So even the first part of Anupam's question about they want to cut social services in order to attract capital, I don't think that's true. They are not actually trying to grow the pie. All they're trying to do is redistribute the pie, and we should call them out on that. Now, you know, that the actual point of Anupam's question was, you know, how is Canada going to maintain what we have done well in the face of these pressures? And that is going to be a challenge, and it's going to be a fight. But again, I stress it's not a utopian exercise. We have done some things, including some good things in Canada recently. I mentioned this Canada Child Tax Benefit that has significantly reduced child poverty in Canada. That's a good thing. And there are other good things that have happened, not because of the magic of markets, but because of Canadians coming together to demand them and use whatever power and influence we can to win them. So it will always be a fight because the other side just wants to redivide the pie in their favor, and we can't let them.
Well, on that very clear note of on the class nature of Canadian politics and economics, I think I'll draw this to a close. I apologize to many of you whose questions have not been addressed, but I think we had a healthy dialogue. There was one question in particular that relates to the session tomorrow that Thomas Martois is speaking at about public banking. And so I think that question, you could raise that tomorrow with the panel. So with that, thank you all very much, Marliss Taylor, Jim Stanford, Mark Anielski. I want to thank Lindsay McLaren for her great organizational skills and the great assistance of Ricardo and the staff at Parkland. And we'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock for the second session of this conference. So good evening to you all. Take care.